I'm not the type who usually stops to help strangers, but that night, with the rain pouring and the road empty, something made me stop. It was New Year's Eve. I was driving home to rural Kentucky, and the weather was gloomier than usual. Visibility was terrible, water cascading down the roads. But there he was, a man standing next to a car with the hood up, shivering from the cold. He seemed to be in trouble, and I, trying to be a good person, decided to stop. At first, he was polite, thanked me for stopping, and explained that the car had broken down in the middle of nowhere, with no phone signal or any form of contact. He seemed as relieved as I was irritated about having to get out of the car in that cold. But I still decided I would help. He got into my car without hesitation, telling me he was going to a village in a neighboring town, but something didn't feel right. I asked the name of the place, and he hesitated. "Oh, it's a small place, I don't think you know it," he replied, and that was the first sign that something was wrong. During the journey, he didn't say much. I kept the conversation going, trying to start a conversation, asking about what he was doing, if he was going somewhere special, but his answers were always vague. Apparently he worked on some construction-related things, but the strangest thing was the backpack he carried with him. It was closed in a way that seemed to hide something, but he never let me see the contents. I don't know why, but I started to feel uncomfortable. I was there, driving down a deserted road, with a stranger beside me, and the feeling that I had made a huge mistake began to consume me. The rain continued to pound against the windshield, making the background sound almost hypnotic, but my mind couldn't relax. I tried to concentrate on the road, but it was difficult to ignore his presence there, so still. The smell of a cheap perfume was starting to bother me too, and I couldn't identify what it was. I just knew it gave me goosebumps. When I made a sharp turn, he leaned forward a little and said, "You can take a shorter road, it will be faster." I was surprised by the suggestion, mainly because I lived in the region and knew the roads. He was asking for something very specific, as if he knew something I didn't, and it made me wonder why he seemed so familiar with the area. I looked at him in the rearview mirror, and at that moment, our eyes met. He had a subtle smile, but the kind of smile that didn't touch his eyes, and that made me even more tense. The road he suggested wasn't really an alternative that I would normally use, but with the bad weather and the need to get there quickly, I ended up giving in. Maybe it was a mistake, but it was too late to turn back. While I was driving, he started moving his backpack, discreetly, but I could still see the movement. I felt a growing pressure in my chest, and the fear was no longer just in my ideas, but in my entire body. Every now and then he would look out the window, as if he were observing something I couldn't see, but he wouldn't say anything. Every minute seemed like an eternity, and the rain didn't help to improve the mood. It only increased the feeling that something was wrong, very wrong. I reached a point where the road was completely deserted, with no more houses or lights in sight. Just the sound of rain and the sound of tires in the mud. His car was still in my head. It was strange that, even though I stopped to help, he didn't give more details about what had happened. I didn't remember seeing any service signs or gas station signs there. I was starting to get paranoid. When I saw a rural area sign, a feeling of claustrophobia came over me, as if the road was swallowing me. I looked in the rearview mirror again, and the man looked like he was asleep, but something about him wasn't right. He sat so still, his shoulders square and his hands clenched on his backpack, that I couldn't relax. Then, suddenly, he moved abruptly. He looked straight ahead, then at me and said without any introduction, "I'm not going to that village, you know that, don't you?" I froze. My stomach turned. He was watching me with a disturbing calm, and I noticed that even with the rain and the poor road conditions, he didn't seem to care at all about his fate. He wasn't going where he said he would. My heart was beating fast, and I knew something was wrong. At that moment, he began to laugh, a low laugh, almost imperceptible, but it chilled me to the bone. He then looked to the side and said, casually, "We'll just stop later. Don't worry." The feeling that I had made a bad decision no longer left me. I didn't know what to do. The road was getting darker and darker, and it felt like he was taking me to a place I didn't recognize. My thoughts were racing, trying to find a solution, but my body just wanted me to stop the car and get away. The pressure in my chest was almost unbearable. The strangest thing of all was that he didn't seem at all pressured or anxious, as if it was normal to be in that situation. He turned to me again, this time without smiling, and said something that still echoes in my mind to this day. "You helped me, but there are things we can't control." I had no idea what that meant. He had started to behave even more strangely, as if he was trying to make me feel uncomfortable. My nervousness only increased, and the feeling of danger was so palpable that I could no longer ignore it. It was then that I saw something in the reflection of the rearview mirror, something that made my blood run cold. There was a car behind us, but not a normal headlight light. It was a strange, somewhat diffuse light that didn't seem to move as it should. As I looked closer, I noticed that the light was getting closer and closer, without showing any sign of slowing down. I started to accelerate, trying to gain distance, but the car seemed to follow me. My stomach twisted in a way I had never experienced before, a mixture of fear and survival instinct. I looked at the man next to me, but he seemed completely oblivious to what was happening, as if the car behind us was a sight only I was seeing. "Don't worry about it," he murmured, as if it were irrelevant. But those words sounded more like a threat than a comfort. That situation was dragging on, and I felt panic growing inside me. The car behind us kept getting closer, and my mind was in complete despair, looking for any way to get out of there. I was starting to make tighter turns, desperately trying to lose the car, but it wouldn't move an inch. The rain continued to fall in torrents, making everything even more difficult. I looked at the man, who now looked more uncomfortable, but still didn't do anything. He was just looking straight ahead, as if everything was normal. At that moment, my head was in a whirlwind of thoughts, but one thing was clear. I needed to stop driving. I needed to find a way to get off that road, and soon. The car behind me was already so close that I could see its silhouette in the rearview mirror, like a menacing shadow. That's when I made a decision. I stopped the car abruptly, with the tires skidding in the mud, and turned on the emergency lights. The sound of the rain now seemed deafening, but what scared me even more was the fact that the car behind us didn't stop. It simply continued to advance towards us without slowing down, until, at the last second, it passed by us with terrifying speed. I stood frozen, watching the vehicle disappear into the darkness. My breathing was labored, and I felt an indescribable cold, as if an invisible presence had just left us. The man next to me finally moved. He looked at me with that cold smile and said, "I told you so, you shouldn't have stopped." At that moment, the only thing I wanted was to go home, get away from that road, that man, everything. But when I looked to the side, he was no longer there. He was gone. I stood there, standing in the car, with the emergency lights flashing, unable to process what had just happened. Fear still paralyzed me, as if what I had experienced was a nightmare that didn't want to end. I looked around, trying to understand what had happened, but there was no sign of the man anywhere. I knew he had gotten out of the car, but I couldn't understand how he had disappeared so quickly, without making a sound. There was no door noise, no footsteps, nothing. The car that had passed us was still disappearing into the distance, and I was completely alone on a deserted, rainy road, feeling like something very wrong had happened, but not knowing exactly what. I tried to start the car and get out of there, but my hands were shaking so much that I could only start the engine after a few minutes. When I finally managed to accelerate and get back onto the main road, I still couldn't understand what had just happened. The feeling that I was being watched didn't leave me for a second, and the fear only increased. When I finally arrived in the city, I realized that everything had stopped as if by magic. There was no sign of any car or presence along the way, and, more importantly, there were no more signs of the stranger or the car that was chasing me. The next morning, at home, I tried to tell someone what I had experienced, but the words didn't come out the way I wanted. It was as if, when I tried to explain it, I knew no one would believe it. No one would ever believe it because it seemed impossible. But to this day, I can't forget what happened that night, and the feeling that, somehow, it wasn't just the man who disappeared. I also disappeared in that place. Something on that road changed me, and I don't know what it was. I was never a person to believe in supernatural things or spend a lot of time looking at me in the mirror, but after what happened to me 3 months ago, I can barely stay in the same environment as one. It all started on a normal Wednesday. I had just arrived from work extremely tired after a tense meeting with my boss. I went straight to take a shower to relax and, while brushing my teeth, noticed something strange. At first, it was very subtle. I thought it was just tiredness preaching me pieces. Do you know when you're exhausted and start seeing things with the corner of your eye? So I thought it was it. But as I leaned down to spit the toothpaste, I swear I saw my reflection stand for a fraction of a second. It was so fast that, at the time, I just shook my head and continued my routine. The day followed normally. I went to work as usual, but that weird feeling didn't come out of my head. When I returned home at night, I went straight to the bathroom to get ready to sleep. That's when I realized that there was something very wrong. As I passed my facial cream, I paid more attention to the mirror and noticed that my expression looked different. I don't know how to explain it properly, but it was as if my face in the reflection did not correspond exactly to my movements. Sometimes I smiled, but my reflection took a half-second to follow. At other times, I swore that I saw my eyes moving in the mirror when I was sure I was standing, staring at the same point. I started to feel a cold in my belly and that horrible feeling that it was being observed. I tried to convince myself that it was just my tired mind preaching me pieces. After all, I had slept badly in the last days, but something inside me knew it was more happening. I decided to take a test. I positioned myself in front of the mirror and started making random movements with my hands, just to make sure I wasn't getting crazy. At first, everything seemed normal, but after a couple of minutes doing it, something happened that made my blood freeze. I had stopped moving my hands, but my reflection continued to move for a few seconds. It was not an impression, it was not my imagination. I was paralyzed with fear watching my reflection move my fingers as my hands were completely stopped. At the time, I felt my whole body shake and a cold sweat went down my background. I ran out of the bathroom and went straight to my room, trying to calm down and rationalize what had just happened. I spent a few minutes sitting on the bed, taking a deep breath and trying to convince me that I was having some kind of hallucination because of stress. After calming down a little, I decided that I needed to face that. I went back to the bathroom, but this time I took my cell phone to film the mirror. I thought if something strange happened again, at least there would be a proof. But of course nothing happened while I was filming. I was about 15 minutes there, making faces, stirring my arms, flashing, and everything seemed perfectly normal. I almost convinced myself that I had imagined everything, until I decided to watch the video I had recorded. That's when my world fell. In the video, I could clearly see that while I was flashing normally, my reflection kept my eyes open by some more frames. It was subtle, but it was there. I watched that video about 10 times in a row in slow motion, frame for frame, and there was no denying it. That reflection was not me, or at least it was not synchronized with me as it should be. At this point, I went into total panic. I started to cover all the mirrors of the house with sheets, towels, anything I found ahead. My hands trembled so much that I could barely tie my cloths right. I tried to call my best friend to tell what was going on, but I gave up halfway. She would think I had completely freaked out, and maybe I was really freaking out, right? But then something happened that ended any questions I could still have. When I was covering the last mirror, my wardrobe, I realized that my reflection was smiling. It wasn't a normal smile, it was a strange, half-crooked smile that I was definitely not doing. I was paralyzed looking at that surreal scene. Me there, with an expression of pure terror on my face, while my reflection kept that disturbing smile. I dropped the sheet that was holding and ran out of the room. I ran to the living room and threw myself on the couch, trying to sue what was happening. My heart beat so hard that it seemed to explode. I was sitting there, hugging my knees, trying to calm down and think about what to do. I couldn't call the police. They would laugh at my face. I couldn't tell anyone. They were going to be hospitalized in a psychiatric clinic. Worst of all, I couldn't even use the bathroom or get ready without having to face a mirror. I took my cell phone and started searching the internet about similar experiences. I found some reports of people who claimed to have gone through similar things, but nothing exactly the same. Most stories looked fake or too exaggerated. But I knew what was happening to me was real. It was different. While scrolling the phone screen, desperately looking for answers, I heard a noise from my room, a sound of something being dragged. I was paralyzed on the couch for a few seconds, trying to decide whether to check the noise or not. The sound had stopped, but now I could listen clearly from the hallway. Steps that seemed to imitate exactly the way I walk. My whole body shivered as I realized that the steps were approaching the room. I gathered all the courage I had and looked at the hallway. There was no one there, but the steps continued. It was as if something invisible was walking around my house. At that moment, I noticed that the sheet I had dropped to the bedroom floor was being dragged by the hall, as if someone was pulling, but I couldn't see who or what was doing it. Panic took over me when I realized that the sheet was moving toward me. I got up and ran to the kitchen, taking the first thing I saw ahead, a knife. My hands trembled so much that I could barely hold right. The sheet was still dragging on, now entering the room, and stopped right in the middle of the room. I was there, paralyzed, holding the knife and watching. Suddenly the sheet began to rise alone as if floating and was taking a shape, a way that looked exactly with my silhouette. It was as if I was looking in a mirror, but instead of my reflection, there was only a white sheet floating in the shape of my body. I felt my legs weakened and almost fainted right there. At that moment, I did the only thing I could think. I threw the knife on the floor and ran out of the house. I didn't get a bag, I didn't get a cell phone, I didn't get anything. I only really broke barefoot, using my pajamas, regardless of what the neighbors would think. When I arrived on the sidewalk, I looked back and saw something that makes me doubt my sanity to this day. Through the living room window, I managed to see that white form moving, and she started to look at me. I couldn't see a face, it was just the outline of the sheet, but I could feel I was watching me. And then, in a second fraction, the sheet fell to the floor, completely empty. I stood there, shaking, not knowing what to do, until I decided to sit on the sidewalk and wait for the sun to be born. The frightening is that when I came home, already in the morning, everything was normal. The sheet was folded on the couch, the knife in the kitchen drawer, and all the discovered mirrors. For a moment, I thought I had dreamed it all, but when I went to look in the bathroom mirror, I realized that my reflection blinked at me. It was only once, very fast, but I'm absolutely sure of what I saw. Since then, I avoid looking at any reflective surface. I took all the mirrors out of my house and I cover the windows at night. I know it sounds crazy, but it happened. And the worst is that sometimes, when I'm walking on the street and I pass a showcase, I swear I see my reflection watching me for a few seconds after I've passed, as if I was waiting for me to leave so I can move freely. I never thought something like this could happen to me. I was alone at home that New Year's Eve. My parents had gone out to a party and I was calm, playing video games without many worries. It was another ordinary night, until my cell phone started vibrating, indicating several missed calls. When I looked, I saw that they were the same number, which was not saved in my calendar. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it. As I was distracted, I ignored it. However, the messages that started to arrive made me uncomfortable. The first one said, "Hey man, I hope you bought beer for the party." I stopped for a second, not understanding. No one knew I was home alone, and I definitely hadn't bought anything. I started to think it was a joke from a friend. Maybe someone had gotten another friend's number and was doing it just to scare me. Then things got weirder. The sofa is a little overturned. isn't it? If you go to the kitchen, your father left the remote control on the table. I looked around, and the couch was actually a little out of alignment. My father always leaves the controller on that table in the kitchen when he gets home from work. How did anyone know this? I started to get a little nervous, but I still thought it might be a joke. I decided not to respond, thinking that if I didn't interact, the person would lose interest. But the messages continued to arrive. The messages started to become even more invasive. You're in your room now, right? I bet you're listening to music. Your headphones are on the chair, where you always leave them. It was impossible not to be scared. How could anyone know all this? I was alone. There was no one around. The worst thing is that the message came right after I had taken off my headphones and left them on the chair. Something that no one but me knew about. I started looking around the house, but everything was silent. There was no one there. The phone vibrated again. Did you know that your parents will be back later than expected? They should arrive around midnight. It will be a good time for you to enjoy. How was this happening? I hadn't even said anything about my parents. That's when I really started to feel a shiver down my spine. The next message was the most specific of all. Your mom's car is parked out front, right? The parking lot is pretty empty, so it's easy to see. I looked out the living room window and my mother's car was there, parked the way she always leaves it, right near the entrance. I hadn't seen anyone park. Suddenly I felt a chill. I knew something wasn't right. It was as if someone was inside the house, watching my every move. But how was that possible? I could no longer believe it was a simple joke. With each message that arrived, I felt more trapped inside the house. It was like I was being watched closely, and that bothered me more than anything else. The next message was even more direct. The hallway light is on. You should turn it off before going to sleep. I looked down the hall, and sure enough, the light was on. I always left it on when I was alone at night so I wouldn't be left in the dark. But I didn't remember mentioning this to anyone. Panicked, I finally decided to respond, just to see where this went. Who are you? I typed quickly, but the response didn't even take 30 seconds. It's me, Mike. Don't you remember me? I froze. Mike? I didn't know any Mike who had that number. I looked at my cell phone again, and the number wasn't saved, but something deep down told me that I knew that name. Something was wrong. That's when the phone rang. It was the same number. I hesitated but ended up answering. I remained silent on the other end of the line, waiting for the person to speak. But the only thing I heard was a muffled sound, as if someone was trying to whisper but failing. Then the voice sounded, a deep, almost whispered tone. I'm at your door. My eyes widened. My entire body tensed. I knew the front door was locked, but something told me it wouldn't be that simple. I heard one more whisper. I'm here. I looked down the hall again, but didn't see anything. The silence was too heavy. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I was almost convinced that I wasn't home alone anymore. I stood frozen, listening to the silence that seemed to swallow me. Breathing was heavy and every sound in the house seemed amplified. That whisper was still in my head. I'm here. The anxiety was growing, and I didn't know what to do. I decided to check the front door, but before I got there, another message appeared on my cell phone. You know, there's no point in locking the door. I can come in at any time. I stared at the screen, not believing what I was reading. I knew no one was there, or at least I thought I did. It was impossible. I started to feel a cold sweat, but I still got up and walked to the door, my feet feeling heavy with each step. When I arrived at the entrance, I stood there, just watching the locked door, and at the same time, I felt like something was about to happen. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for anything. I had to do something. So, with nothing left to lose, I quickly opened the door, expecting to see nothing, or maybe someone playing a stupid prank. But the door was empty. I stood there, looking at the deserted street, the street lights flickering in the distance. Nobody. I looked everywhere, but the only thing I could hear was the wind. I breathed a sigh of relief, but at the same time, I felt a strange feeling that it wasn't over. I closed the door and locked it again, and as I turned to go back into the living room, I noticed something that made me freeze. The phone vibrated one last time. It was a message from the same number. "I'm inside." My heart started beating so hard I could hear it. I looked at my cell phone. The words paralyzed me. "I'm inside the house." I could no longer trust my own senses. I had just closed the door and there was no one on the street. So how was this possible? The feeling of being watched became even more intense. It was as if someone was standing next to me, breathing down my neck. I was in a panic. I didn't know what else to do. I looked at the hallways, at the rooms, at every corner of the house, but everything was silent. What made me most nervous was that I didn't see anyone. But the message kept tormenting me. "You don't see me, but I'm here. Look some more." I felt an icy shiver run down my spine. I didn't know if I should scream, run, or do anything, but everything felt wrong. I decided to call the police. I couldn't deal with it alone anymore. My hand shook as I dialed the number. The phone rang a few times until someone answered. "Brooklyn Police, how can I help you?" The attendant's voice was calm, but I couldn't speak. I could only make a muffled sound, as if my voice had been ripped from my throat. I could barely breathe. "Are you well?" the person asked, calmer now, probably hearing my panic. I tried to explain, but the call was interrupted. The line went dead, and that's when I heard something even more frightening. A creaking door, a low, almost imperceptible sound coming from the hallway outside. Worst of all was what came next. A message, as always, arrived on the screen. "I am the door." Those words were like a punch in the stomach. I was paralyzed, barely able to move. The door was locked, I knew that, but the sound was getting stronger, closer. The creaking of the door increased, as if someone was trying to open it slowly. I looked at the hallways. My breathing was labored and my vision was blurred with fear. What scared me most was that there was no one there, but the sound continued. I knew if I went out to check it would be worse. So I crouched down behind the couch, trying to make as little noise as possible. My cell phone still vibrating in my hand, non-stop. The feeling of being watched was engulfing me, and I didn't know what to think anymore. The sound of the door stopped suddenly, as if something was stopping it from opening, but still, I knew something was there. Suddenly, everything was quiet. I waited for the next sound, the next message, the next terrifying thing, but nothing happened. The phone went silent, the sound of the door disappeared, and silence took over the house. I stood there, in the dark, not understanding what was happening. There were no more calls, no messages. After a while, I dared to get out from behind the sofa and looked around the house. Everything was in the same place, nothing had changed, but the feeling of fear seemed to have become even stronger. I never knew what that was, who was sending me those messages, or how they knew so much about me. What I know is that, to this day, I have not been able to explain what happened that night. I was never home alone on New Year's Eve again. I've never been much of a thinker about things that happen at work. I'm an app driver and, most of the time, I only do what they ask me to do. But that night, on New Year's Eve, something really gave me goosebumps. The day had been peaceful until that moment. I was tired but decided to take one last run. It was almost midnight and, for some reason, that order appeared right in the middle of an upper-class neighborhood in Pasadena. When I arrived, the guy was there, waiting on the sidewalk. He seemed completely normal, but something about him made me alert. Everything was silent, not a song, not a word. He got into the car without saying anything, just giving the address vaguely, as if it were a place I didn't know. Something like, on the street near the station. I just accepted it and started driving, but something in the air was different. The worst part was the silence during the entire journey. The guy didn't say a word. I tried to start a conversation, ask him about what he was going to do on New Year's Eve or something like that, but he just fidgeted with his cell phone, his fingers fast on the screen, as if he didn't want to interact. It's unusual for someone to be so quiet, and I've taken a lot of silent passengers, but this guy seemed so empty. The streets became more deserted as we moved away from the busiest part of Pasadena. The weather was weird, and I started to feel uncomfortable. But what made me most uncomfortable was the fact that he seemed completely oblivious to everything. When I arrived at the street near the station, the guy simply said it was there, and before I could ask anything, he opened the door and left without looking back. I stood there, still, not understanding what had just happened, until I noticed a small package left in the back seat, as if on purpose. I stood there, not knowing what to do. The first thing I thought was that maybe the guy had forgotten the package, but what weirded me out was the way he got out of the car, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. There wasn't a second of hesitation, nothing. He just opened the door and walked away, without looking back. The package was there, simple, small, with a black ribbon. It looked like something you would buy in a gift shop, but it didn't have any kind of tag or brand on it. I watched for a long time, trying to understand what was happening, until something made me open the car door and grab the package. I don't know what made me do it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something important, something I had to see. When I picked up the package, the weight didn't make sense. It was light, but at the same time it had a kind of solidity, as if there was something inside that wasn't what it seemed to be. I stood there, holding it, trying to think of what to do. I tried to open it, but the tape was stuck tightly. It was not easy to remove. I hesitated for a few seconds, wondering if I should leave it there and walk away, but curiosity was too strong. When I finally managed to open the package, my breathing almost stopped. Inside, there was nothing but a key, an old key with a strange shape like those old keys from old houses. But what confused me even more was the piece of paper that was held together with a rubber band. There was nothing written on it, but the texture was different, rougher, as if it were made of something I had never seen before. It was like some kind of warning, but from whom? And why me? At that moment, what made me most uneasy was not just the mystery of the key or the paper. It was the fact that, somehow, I had the feeling that the situation hadn't ended there. I didn't know what to do with the key, but I knew it meant something. Something I couldn't understand, but that felt urgent. I went back to the car, put the key on the seat next to it and started it. I decided to leave, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't let go. The streets were empty, and the silence was oppressive. New Year's Eve was approaching, but I couldn't shake that feeling of anguish. I began to wonder if I had made the right choice in picking up that package, or if I had fallen into something much bigger than I could have imagined. As I passed the last corner, a crazy idea crossed my mind. What if the key had something to do with that neighborhood where I had left the passenger? I knew there was an old house there, a mansion that always seemed to have something strange about it. I didn't know exactly where, but something inside me said the key could open something in that house. The problem is, when I thought about it, the idea of going back to that place made me shudder. I didn't want to, but curiosity was consuming me. I decided to take a walk and go back there. When I got close to the entrance to the neighborhood, I noticed that the streetlights were flashing erratically. Something wasn't right. It was as if the place was being swallowed by a type of darkness that seemed thicker than usual. I got closer, and then, from a distance, I saw the house. It was there, huge, with the windows closed and a feeling of abandonment in the air. When I stopped the car in front of that mansion, my hand was sweating. The package was there, still on the bench next to me, and the key seemed to shine brighter in front of me. It was as if he was calling me, asking me to act. I didn't know why, but I felt like if I didn't go there, I would never have peace again. It was as if everything around me had been orchestrated to take me to that place, to that house. The fear I felt now wasn't just fear of something strange or supernatural. It was a feeling that if I didn't do what that key seemed to ask, things would get worse. I took a deep breath and got out of the car, walking towards the entrance of the mansion. The path was dark, and the biting wind seemed to whisper words I couldn't understand. When I reached the door, the key fit perfectly into the lock, as if it had been made for it. The sound of metal spinning was strange, like a muffled scream that echoed through the silent night. The door creaked open, and the darkness inside seemed to swallow me. I entered little by little, not knowing what to expect. The smell of mold and old wood filled my nostrils, and I almost gave up right then and there. But something, a force I couldn't identify, pushed me inside. When I took my first steps, I realized I wasn't alone. There was something else in that place, a presence that seemed to watch me. I could feel eyes on me, but I couldn't see anything. Everything was completely silent, except for my own footsteps echoing down the hallway. That's when I saw a faint light coming from one of the rooms. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I needed to go there. With each step I took, the tension increased, and the air became thicker. I was scared, but the need to find out what was happening pushed me further and further. When I entered the bright room, I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. The place was empty except for a table in the center covered with an old cloth. The dim light came from a candle that was lit there, and on the table there was a thick book with an aged leather cover. Next to the book, there was a black and white photograph with an image of a smiling family, but something about the photograph made me shiver. The people there seemed, different. Their eyes were too deep, as if they were looking at something beyond the camera, beyond what any human being could see. I didn't know what to do, but the feeling that I had already come this far for a reason became even stronger. I knew I needed to open the book. I needed to understand what was happening. The key, the package, the mansion, everything seemed to be leading me to this. I took a deep breath and approached the table, but before I could touch the book, something strange happened. The candle went out on its own, as if a gust of wind had passed by. The silence became even heavier. I stood frozen, trying to understand what was happening, but before I could react, the room door slammed shut. The noise was so loud that I almost fell back. I quickly turned around, but there was no one there, just the dark corridor and a cold that seemed to have settled in the place. I tried to turn on the light, but the electricity was out, and I couldn't understand what was happening. I decided to get out of there, but when I went to the door, it was locked. I screamed. I tried to force it, but nothing worked. Panic began to consume me, and for a moment, I felt like that house was alive. The feeling that he was being watched became unbearable. It wasn't just an old house. It was something more, something I couldn't see but that I knew was there, surrounding me. It was then that, out of nowhere, everything stopped. The door opened by itself. When the door opened, I didn't know whether to be relieved or even more scared. It was as if the house had suddenly calmed down, as if it had let me go, but in a strange way. I ran away, without looking back, with my heart pounding. The air was cold and, for a moment, I thought I might have dreamed it all, but the weight of the key in my pocket and the fear that still consumed me told me I hadn't. When I got back to the car, the first thing I did was look in the back seat. The package was still there, but something was different. I didn't know what, but the feeling that that key had been part of something much bigger, something I couldn't control, dominated me. What was that house? Who were those people in the photo? And scariest of all, why me? The key was still with me, and to this day I can't get rid of it. I never found the address of the house. I never knew what was going on. But since that day, my life has never been the same. The fear, the feeling of being followed, everything accompanies me to this day. And, even stranger, since I left that house, I can't explain it, but I've never seen that passenger again. He disappeared, as if he had never existed. But the key is still with me, and I don't know what to do with it. I work as a nurse in palliative care for over 12 years, and always considered myself a very skeptical and rational person. Of course, I had heard stories from other professionals about strange experiences with terminal patients, but I never gave much importance. I have always attributed these reports to the emotional stress of the work or the imagination of people. After all, dealing with death every day is not easy, and it is natural for people to try to find some meaning or comfort in all this. But something changed after that night shift last month, and since then I can't stop thinking about what happened. I even have difficulty sleeping, passing every detail to my head, trying to find some logical explanation that makes sense. It was on a particularly agitated Wednesday. We had 5 terminal patients that night, and I was doing my first round around 11 p.m. when I noticed something different with Mr. Roberto, a 78-year-old man with advanced cancer. He was awake, which was unusual at that time, especially considering the amount of pain medication he was receiving. But that's not all that caught my attention. There was something different in his way. His eyes were fixed in the corner of the room, near the window, and there was a smile on his face that I had never seen before. It was not a smile of joy exactly. It was more like recognition, like when you find a friend you haven't seen for a long time. I confess that I felt a shiver on my spine when I realized that the temperature in that corner of the room was visibly lower than in the rest of the environment. I approached his bed trying to keep his calm and professional posture, but something inside me was different. I began to check his vital signs as usual, but couldn't take my eyes out of that corner of the room. It was as if there was a presence there, something I couldn't see right, but I could feel. Mr. Roberto began to murmur softly, as if talking to someone. At first I thought it was delirium caused by medication, something that had seen hundreds of times before. But his words were too clear, too coordinated. He was talking about his wife Maria, who had died 3 years ago, how happy she was to see her there. My hands trembled as I wrote down the data in the medical record, and for the first time in years of profession, I was afraid of staying in that room. I left as soon as I finished the necessary procedures and went to do the other visits, trying to convince myself that it was just another case of pre-death hallucination, something common in terminal patients. But when I entered Donna Clyde's room, 2 doors later, the same scene was repeated. She was also awake, staring at the same relative point as the room, the corner near the window. And the frightening, she smiled the same way as Mr. Roberto, that recognition smile. My whole body shivered when she started talking to her son Carlos, who had died in a car accident 10 years ago. Again, I felt that strange and located cold, as if someone had opened a window just in that bedroom corner. But all windows were closed, as always stay at night. At that moment, I began to question everything I always believed about life and death. It was not possible that it was coincidence 2 patients on the same night with exactly the same behavior. I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept going back to those smiles, those fixed looks, that inexplicable cold. While checking the other patients, I realized that I was avoiding looking at the corners of the rooms, as if I was afraid of what I could see there. That's when I passed Mr. Roberto's room again and heard a noise. His heart monitor was whistling different. I ran inside and, at that moment, I saw something that I will never forget. A shadow, definitely a human form, moving in that same cold corner of the room. It didn't last longer than a second, but it was real. As real as the serene smile on Mr. Roberto's face when the monitor indicated that his heart had stopped. My legs were bambos and I had to support the wall. I triggered the cardiac stop automatically, but knew it was different. It was not a busy death or suffered as so many that he had already witnessed. It was as if he simply, accompanied. While waiting for the team to arrive, I noticed something even more disturbing. That shadow I had seen was no longer in the corner of the room. Now I could see, by the corner of the eye, that she had moved near the door. And I wasn't alone. There were other dark forms, almost imperceptible, as if they were waiting. The air was so heavy that it could barely breathe. I tried to convince myself that it was just tiredness, that I was imagining things, but then I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. When I turned, there was no one there, but that touch was too real to be imagination. The doctors arrived and declared the death of Mr. Roberto at 00H47. As they filled the paperwork, I went to check Donna Clyde again, already wondering what she would find. She was there, still smiling, but now her words were weaker, almost whispers. "He's calling me, he says it's time," she repeated without stopping. The cold in the room was more intense, and now I could see my own breath in the air. The shadows he had seen in Mr. Roberto's room seemed to have multiplied. They were in the corners near the door around the bed. They were not threatening, but their presence was undeniable. I tried to focus on her vital signs, but my eyes kept looking for movement in the shadows. That was when I realized that some of them seemed to have faces that appeared and disappeared as reflexes in the water. Donna Clyde left at 1:23 a.m. with the same serene smile as Mr. Roberto. This time I was alone in the room, and I swear I could hear voices whispering, as if several people were talking at the same time, but very softly. The strangest thing is that, among the whispers, I recognized some words were names of patients we had lost in the last few weeks. My hands trembled so much that I could barely register the time of death. When I finally left the room, I saw something that made me freeze. There was a trail of small drops of water on the floor, going from the corner of the room to the door. The air conditioning was working normally. There was no leakage, no logical explanation for that water being there. When I bent down to play one of the drops, I felt the same intense cold that I felt in the corners of the rooms. I spent the rest of the duty in a state of full alert, realizing things that I had never noticed before in all these years of profession. The corridors looked different at dawn, as if they were wider, longer. The fluorescent lights flashed strangely as I passed, and sometimes I had the impression of seeing people walking away. But when it looked directly, there was no one. The worst was the reflections on windows of the windows around, and then I saw faces there, faces of former patients I recognized, but when I blinked, they disappear. I tried to take care with bureaucratic work, but it was impossible to ignore that constant feeling of being observed. Each time I entered a room, I could feel glances from every corner, and that cold that now seemed to follow me everywhere. Around 4 a.m., something happened that made me completely question my sanity. I was organizing some medical records at the nursing post when I heard a very low song, almost inaudible. It was Affectionate, Mr. Jose's favorite song, a patient we had lost the week before. The sound seemed to come from the room where he had stayed, which was now empty. When I went to check it out, the song stopped, but I found it, bent perfectly over the unoccupied bed. A blue handkerchief just like Mr. Jose always carried in his pocket. I'm absolutely sure that bed was empty and nothing on top when I spent half an hour before. I took the scarf with trembling hands. It was cold, as if I had just left a freezer, and had a strong coffee smell, his favorite drink. When my duty finally ended at 7 a.m., I was completely exhausted, not only physically but emotionally. I spent the last hour of the shift sitting at the nursing post, holding that cold handkerchief and watching the shadows that now I could see clearly moving through the corridors. They looked more numerous as the sun was beginning to be born, as if they were preparing to hide from daylight. Before leaving, I returned to the rooms of Mr. Roberto and Donna Clyde, who were already empty. The cold was gone, but in each of the corners where the shadows had appeared, I found small drops of water, almost drying. I took some pictures with my cell phone, but when I went to look later, the images were completely blurred, as if there was a dense mist covering everything. It's been a month since that night, and I've never had a duty like that again. The shadows still appear from time to time, always in the same corners, always accompanied by that intense cold, but have never been as clear or numerous as at dawn. Mr. Jose's blue handkerchief is still stored in the drawer of my bedside table, still cold, still smelling of coffee, as if time did not pass to him. Some co-workers began to notice as well. Occasionally, someone comments on a strange cold in some quarter, about happiness, over patients smiling and talking to invisible people moments before they departed. I can't explain what happened that night, nor why I could see what I saw. I only know that now, when I enter a room and see a patient smiling at the corner, I no longer try to find rational explanations. I just smile back, knowing that they are not alone in their final moments.